Hello and welcome to Mr. Gardner's Film Studies channel. This video is going to be about Pulp Fiction. And the cat's in the cradle and the silver spoon, little boy blue and the man on the moon. This is part one of a three-part video. So before I actually start getting into the nitty-gritty of discussing the film and Quentin Tarantino, I should point out now that there are going to be spoilers for Pulp Fiction, and there are going to be spoilers for his other films, because obviously we're looking at him as an auteur, and that means looking at the rest of his work. And also, if you know anything about Quentin Tarantino, you know that his films are pretty graphic. Most of them, I think all of them in fact, are 18 certificates. So there will be scenes which feature strong bloody violence, coarse language, racial slurs, and also scenes of sexual violence. So if you are offended by any of those things or are likely to be upset by them, then I would recommend that you do not watch the rest of this video. Sorry. Pulp Fiction is one of the films you can study for the Eduqas A-Level for Film Studies. It's on Component 2 exam, Section D, and that topic is called Experimental Film. There are two specialist study areas, and that is Auteur and Narrative, and of course we have our three core study areas which we do for every film. So that's film form, meaning and response, including representation and aesthetics, and finally context. An unofficial study area, and one that you should definitely familiarise yourself with, is postmodernism. So Pulp Fiction is described as, by the exam board, the epitome of postmodern filmmaking. So I would certainly recommend that you do some research into postmodernism if that is a movement that you're not that familiar with. And this topic, as I said, is called experimental film. I'm not going to spend ages talking about what is and what isn't experimental film. Suffice to say, experimental films are ones that challenge conventional, typical ways of making films. And that word challenge has come up quite a few times on previous exam questions. So you should definitely think about how your films challenge conventional filmmaking. And they'll also ask you how far it challenges conventional filmmaking techniques. So you'll need to think about that. Is it a film that challenges cinematography or narrative very much? Or is it a film that doesn't challenge those things very much? Is it quite conventional in its approach to cinematography or narrative or whatever it might be? And Pulp Fiction came out in 1994, and it might not seem that challenging now if you're watching it in 2020 or whenever you are watching this. I think part of that is just the nature of time. As time passes, things seem less radical, less challenging, but also bear in mind that Pulp Fiction was a cultural phenomenon, and perhaps a lot of the things that were very experimental at the time have now since become mainstream because it was such an influential film. Lots of filmmakers and lots of films and all aspects really of popular culture took influence from Pulp Fiction, and because of that, now when we watch Pulp Fiction, we're used to those things because of Pulp Fiction. So in essence, what we need to be considering when we're looking at Pulp Fiction is how far is this the work of a postmodern auteur that experiments with narrative and filmmaking in general. And so for this video, we're going to be using the auteur critical approach to look at Pulp Fiction. And I would just quickly say that if you haven't yet seen it, I would recommend that you check out my video on the auteur theory. I'm going to be talking about Francois Truffaut's ideas and Andrew Sarris's ideas. So if you watch that video, you'll understand what I'm talking about when I name check those people. And I usually like to start off these videos with a couple of recommendations, and this one is no different. I would suggest that whenever you are using the auteur critical approach to study a particular film, it's worth watching other films by that director. And for Quentin Tarantino, he has only made 9 films, and apparently he's only going to make one more and then he's going to retire. He's just going to make the 10 and that's him done.
You're saying you got 10 movies in you? And this is it after 10?
That's kind of...
What are you talking about, Quentin?
Well, that's kind of the idea.
So if you wanted, you could just watch all 9, but if you're strapped for time, or if maybe you don't want to watch all 9, and not all of them are great to be honest with you, I would recommend the following: Reservoir Dogs, which is his first film that came out in 1992, Jackie Brown, which came out the one after Pulp Fiction in 1997, Django Unchained, which I believe came out in 2012, I'll check that after I make this video. And then lastly, I'm going to recommend the last film that came out in 2019, which is Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I'd also recommend that you check out one of the films that he wrote a script for but didn't direct. That's True Romance. He's written a few scripts that other directors have taken and turned into films, and I think it's really interesting to see how another director tackles a Tarantino script. And of the ones that he wrote the scripts for and didn't direct, True Romance, I would say, is definitely the best. In terms of book recommendations, I normally recommend these, and I'm going to do it again. The BFI Film Classics book on Pulp Fiction by Dana Poland is really, really great. It talks about Pulp Fiction, obviously, but it looks at it in terms of postmodernism and auteur and narrative, which is basically ticking all the boxes for the exam that you guys would need. And there is loads of material on Tarantino and Pulp Fiction, be it books or YouTube videos or even podcasts. You should definitely check those out if you get a bit of spare time. There is one video I'm going to recommend, and I've put it on a playlist on my channel, and that's his interview with Charlie Rose from 1994, just around the time that Pulp Fiction was due to come out or had just come out. And it talks about his influences, his background, about Pulp Fiction itself, and so that is definitely worth checking out. So to start off with, I'm going to give you a little biography of Quentin Tarantino's life, and the reason why I'm doing that is because Francois Truffaut said that it was the auteur's responsibility to make their films personal on some level, autobiographical. And I think when we look at the life of Quentin Tarantino, his upbringing and his young adult years before he became a filmmaker, we can definitely see a clear influence from his life in his films. So to begin with, Quentin Tarantino was born in 1963, so his childhood was the 60s and the 70s, and we can see that as a big influence on his films in terms of the music and the aesthetic. There's definitely a nostalgia to them, especially the 70s, I think. And with one brief exception, which I'll get to in a moment, he grew up in the city of Los Angeles and spent most of his life there since then. And again, I think this is a huge influence on his films. A lot of his films, including Pulp Fiction, are set in LA. Reservoir Dogs is, Jackie Brown is, and of course his last film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, as the title would indicate, is also set in Los Angeles. His mother was very young when she had him. I think she was 16 years old.
She was only 16 years old.
And because they were so close in age, I think he commented that she treated him almost more like a friend than she did a son, and they would spend a lot of time hanging out together, particularly going to the movies. And when they would go to the movies, the sorts of films that she was taking him to see were probably not the kinds of things that most mothers would take their son to see. So she would be taking him to see maybe exploitation films, very violent films, films that are intended for adults and not for children.
Why were you going to movies when you were 5 like that?
Oh, because I had young parents and they didn't they took me to the movies all the time. And
That's true. I guess when you were 4, your mom would have been around 20.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And they were they took me to movies all the time, and if they were seeing something really radical, like, I don't know, Andy Warhol's Frankenstein or Sweet Sweetback's Badass Song or something like that, then they wouldn't take me. But for the most part, they didn't mind me hanging around.
I know that he saw the film Deliverance when he was just 10 years old, and if anyone has seen the film Deliverance, you will know that that is certainly not a film that many 10-year-olds should probably be watching. And his parents divorced very early on, and his mother raised him pretty much single-handedly for quite a long period of his life. And because of that, he has a great deal of admiration and respect for his mother. He often said that she was a really strong, powerful woman, the kind of lady that you wouldn't mess with.
I never worked under the assumption growing up that, a woman can't do this or can't do that, or that a woman can't do anything.
Sure, because the woman in your life, your mom, could do anything.
Exactly. My mom was strong and hard, and and it's like, she wouldn't take this from a guy.
And again, I think we see that type of woman feature quite a lot in his films, and we'll get to that in a moment. Another big influence on his films and on his life was the fact that his mother had quite a few boyfriends who were black, and because of that, Quentin Tarantino was quite immersed in black culture from a young age, and the school that he went to, I think the majority of students there were black also. So Quentin Tarantino was spending a lot of time hanging out with black people and speaking to them, listening to music by black artists, and also watching blaxploitation films, which is a sort of specific substrand of the exploitation genre, which features black American actors. Most notably Pam Grier, who's in the films Coffee and Foxy Brown, and who Quentin Tarantino would later cast in his film Jackie Brown.
So I'm like watching Soul Train on Saturday and seeing the trailers for that, and listening to K-Day, which was the soul station out here in Los Angeles. But my mom was going out with like a lot of black guys at the time. All right, and one of them was this football player guy, I don't remember his name. So he bought me a football and bought me some boy kind of toy, and took me down to downtown LA. I didn't know where I was, and he was driving down this street, and I felt like I was in this I felt like I was in a black world. Every theater was a blaxploitation film.
At some point during his childhood, his mum became quite sick. So he moved back to Knoxville, which is where he was originally born before he moved to LA. And he stayed there for about a year. And I think it was quite a culture shock for him. So he went from LA, where he was going to a school where the majority of students were black. And now all of a sudden he was hanging out with, kids at his school, and the majority of whom were white, and who he described as racist.
And now I'm going to school in Tennessee, and now I'm, and now I'm about around a bunch of kids who are all racist, all right? And I got to deal with it. It was a very disturbing culture shock, actually. In retrospect, I'm almost glad it happened, because it gave me a different perspective on life, and it gave me a different perspective of class and of people. It took me out of the world that I knew, which actually is not the worst thing in the world to happen to a child.
And I think that was a real shock for him, because a lot of his friends would have been black. A lot of the elder men that he was hanging out with and his mother was dating at the time were also black. So to be hanging out with people with racist attitudes, I think he found that quite difficult to handle. And in terms of his interests growing up, they're pretty much what his interests are now, I think. So he wasn't the kind of young boy who would be going out and playing sports and things like that. Instead, he was more interested in popular culture and would spend a lot of time going to the cinema, reading books, listening to music, and watching television. And so I'll work through those now. When he would go to the cinema, he was definitely into the more obscure end of things. He loved exploitation films, blaxploitation films, kinds of movies that might be described as quite lowbrow or sensationalist in some way. He was a big fan of genre movies, martial arts, kung fu films, spaghetti westerns. I'm not sure if he was into this from a young age, but eventually he really got into French New Wave as well. And what these films had in common, they were often very violent. There'd be lots of swearing in them, narratives that revolved around criminals and drugs. Probably not the sort of thing that many kids his age would have been watching or would have been allowed to watch from such a young age. I think he was quite a big reader as well, read a lot of fiction, and again I think it would have been genre fiction and the more lowbrow stuff. One of his favourite writers is Elmore Leonard, who writes crime genre novels. And in fact, Elmer Leonard wrote the novel Rum Punch, which Jackie Brown is based on. And Pulp Fiction is actually named after a cheap throwaway novel, the sorts of things that you were supposed to read once and then chuck in the bin, and they'd be obviously quite racy and violent, maybe, have sex and bad language and stuff like that in them. And I think by calling the film Pulp Fiction, it shows that he wants to celebrate this genre that a lot of people kind of turn their noses up at, and that he wants to elevate it and say he is proud to be part of that tradition, of that type of literature. And I think another big significant aspect of his love of reading and of novels is that he uses the structure of novels quite a lot in his films, specifically chapters, and we'll look at that a little bit later on when I discuss narrative. He was a big music lover and had a really big record collection, and again I think it tended to be more on the obscure stuff. So although we will see in his movies a lot of music from the 70s.
You ever listen to Kay Billy's Super Sounds of the 70s?
In the 50s and so on is used in his films. It's never the really big pop hits of those decades. It tends to be the forgotten gems, I think, which he's more drawn to, as opposed to the stuff that everybody likes and everybody knows. And he would spend a lot of his time watching TV, and again I think maybe a lot of people might turn their noses up at TV, not so much now, but back in those days it wasn't taken as seriously as films or great works of literature. But for Quentin Tarantino, he thinks that television, just like cheap novels and just like B-movies and genre films, and just like those obscure pop songs, are all fantastic. I always feel slightly conflicted about pointing out this next thing to people who are studying for their A-levels, but Quentin Tarantino famously was a high school dropout. He left school at the age of 15, he didn't go to university, and he didn't go to film school. And I think that explains his idiosyncratic tastes and his influences. So where you get most directors will have gone to film school, and they probably would have learned about the canon of films, the films that you're supposed to admire and respect and be influenced by, like Citizen Kane or Vertigo, for example. Quentin Tarantino didn't have that training, if you like. He has an incredibly extensive knowledge of films. He's entirely self-taught, but the sorts of films that he's knowledgeable on are the kinds of films that don't get taught at university. And there's probably an element of snobbery, I think, to that. People would be looking at the sorts of films that Tarantino is saying, these are the greatest films ever made. This exploitation film or this kung fu film, for example, they would look down their nose at those movies, whereas Tarantino is saying, they're great, they're brilliant. And actually, films like Vertigo I don't think are that fantastic at all.
I really don't get Vertigo. I don't really believe anybody who says they love it to that degree.
And so not only was he studying or teaching himself about films that probably most film directors would be learning about, he was coming at it more from the perspective of a superfan or a film geek, as opposed to a film scholar. And this might sound a bit judgmental to say this, but I think some of the criticism of Tarantino's work is that it's quite superficial and that he understands the surface level of films, but perhaps because he hasn't gone to a film school and done that really sort of serious deep dive, that sort of chin-strokey analysis of great works of cinema, that he doesn't have that in-depth knowledge and understanding and analysis of movies. And so that's why a lot of people might say that his films are, quite frankly, all style and no substance. And so he was very knowledgeable on films from all of the films that he went to see at the cinema at a young age, but he also famously got a job at a video rental store called Video Archives in LA, and that's where he met Roger Avary, one of the other writers for Pulp Fiction. And again, this gave him the opportunity to watch even more movies. The first film that he made, Reservoir Dogs, was quite a big success, and even people who criticised the film recognised straight away that this was a director who seemed to have a very new and very exciting voice, and many of the signatures that Tarantino is known for doing now were evident straight away in Reservoir Dogs. The dialogue heavy exchanges.
I mean, it's obvious. He's barking at me. Every nerve ending, all my senses, blood in my veins, everything I am is screaming, take off, man. Just bail, just get the fuck out of there. Panic hits me like a bucket of water. First there's a shock of it, bam, right in the face. I'm just standing there drenched in panic, and all these sheriffs are looking at me, and they know, man, they can smell it. Sure as that fucking dog can. They can smell it on me.
The use of extreme violence. It's the use of a needle drop score. The pop culture references.
Let me tell you what Like a Virgin's about. It's all about a girl who digs a guy with a big...
He was straight away this director that people felt had a voice and was known for subverting genre expectations. Reservoir Dogs is a heist film where you never actually see the heist. And so he was immediately a hot property in Hollywood. He was offered quite a few films to direct, and one of them was Speed, the Keanu Reeves film from 1994, which he turned down in order to make Pulp Fiction, feeling that he wanted to make something that was going to be a lot more personal to him, which could have been a disaster, but as it happened, it turned out very well. And Pulp Fiction was something that he wrote along with another guy called Roger Avary, and because of that he was able to continue lots of the things that he was doing in Reservoir Dogs through into Pulp Fiction as well, including using some of the same cast members from Reservoir Dogs in Pulp Fiction.
I'm not saying I want to rob banks, I'm just illustrating that if we did, it'd be easier than what we've been doing.
Buddy, what can I get you?
Don't you fucking realize, man, that if Bonnie comes home and finds a dead body in her house, I'm gonna get divorced?
I'm Winston Wolfe. I solve problems.
And just like Hitchcock, Quentin Tarantino was and is a master of self-promotion. So he did that by, like Hitchcock, doing cameos in his films, but unlike Hitchcock, who just very sort of quickly walks on and then off again, Tarantino would cast himself in roles where he would get dialogue. So he actually starts off the film Reservoir Dogs, talks about Madonna's song Like a Virgin.
Like a Virgin's not about some sensitive girl who meets a nice fella. That's what True Blue's about. No, granted, no argument about that.
And he continues this through into Pulp Fiction, where he plays the character of Jimmy, and there are various other cameos that he does throughout his films. On top of that, he did lots of interviews, lots of press. He was on many magazine covers at the time. So he was making himself into a celebrity, and the more celebrity you have, the more power you have, the more power you have, the more creative control you have. So all of these things helped him to become an auteur director and the director that people recognized and that we're talking about. And it's worked out very well for him. On top of that, even in things like the credits and on the poster, you will always see his name quite prominently featured on there. And the studio, I think, recognised as well that it'd be quite beneficial to them to market him as an auteur director. And we see that on Pulp Fiction. So Pulp Fiction was actually a co-write between him and a guy called Roger Avary, and if you watch the Oscars from 1994, when Pulp Fiction wins Best Screenplay, it's Tarantino and Roger Avary who go up to collect that award. But the studio didn't want the credits to say written by Quentin Tarantino and Roger Avary, so instead they told Roger Avary that they were changing it so that they could use the now quite famous written and directed by Quentin Tarantino. And they instead gave Roger Avary a story by credit. And we see that continue on in his films now, so many of his films begin with that famous written and directed by Quentin Tarantino, and a lot of the marketing and sometimes even the credits will say things like the fourth film by Quentin Tarantino, the fifth film, and so on and so on. I think Quentin Tarantino's got this very conscious idea of wanting to create a legacy by saying he's going to do 10 films and then that's it.
I do like the idea of 10 and done. I like the idea that there is an umbilical cord connected to my first film all the way to my last, and then that is the body of work, because I am about my filmography. And frankly, I do feel that a bad film on the filmography affects good films.
He was and is still a star director. He's one of the very few directors that can sell a film, and that's why they can say things like the fifth film by Quentin Tarantino on a poster, because they know that hardcore film fans are excited to see the next film that he does, but also quite casual film fans. When you speak to somebody who might not be massively into films, but you say to them, what are your favourite films ever made? It wouldn't surprise me if a great deal of them would say Pulp Fiction or another film by Quentin Tarantino. He is a very successful, very well-liked director, and his films are very successful and very well-liked too. So this is the end of part 1 of my video on Pulp Fiction and auteur theory, and part 2 will be available in the link below.